Hey guys, Luke on Sean's channel. Today I'm really excited to bring you guys Skull Serpents yet again. It is the spooky season, so we thought we'd bring the spookiest deck to you. This is my take on Skull Serpent. I think it's very fun. It's very much a going second deck. We also take advantage of the Horus engine as well. I'm really excited to get into it, so let's jump straight in. Starting things off, we run 3 copies of the King himself. This is King of the Skull Servants. So for those of you who are not familiar with the gimmick of Skull Servants, what the whole idea is that you have Skull Servant in this deck, King of Skull Servant, and a bunch of white monsters in the deck as well. And all your white monsters count as Skull Servant while they're in the graveyard. So King of Skull Servant basically gains 1000 attack for each Skull Servant that's in your graveyard. So considering that you run a bunch of different white monsters, and this deck relies heavily on milling a bunch of your white monsters into the graveyard, you're able to get King of the Skull Servant up to a ridiculous amount of attacks you're able to swing in for game. So it's definitely very important to run 3 copies of King of Skull Servants. There's a few easy ways to get him out, but he's also a level 1, so it's very easy to normal summon him as well. 3 copies is absolutely essential. I also like to run 2 copies of Skull Servant. It's important that you need to have at least 2 copies in this deck, just because you need Skull Servant specifically to get Wightprince's effect to pop off. I wouldn't recommend running any more than 2, although he is arguably the best card in all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. I think 2 is more than enough for this build right here. 3 copies of Wightbaking. Wightbaking is honestly my favorite white monster. I think he's definitely one of the better ones. For all these cards, I'm not going to be repeating the entire time, but just you need to know that his name becomes Skull Servant while in the graveyard. But not only that, when Wightbaking is sent to the graveyard, what you're able to do is add 2 cards from your deck to your hand that specifically lists Skull Servant or is Skull Servant added to your hand, and then you discard 1 card. This is great because with Wightbaking you're able to search out cards such as your Wightlord, your Wightprince, and you're able to discard them, which is able to further pop off their effects as well. Wightbaking also offers a bit of protection as well, because if a level 3 or lower zombie monster you control be destroy a battle or a card effect, you can actually discard this card instead. So not only is that a good way to protect your monsters, but also gets another Skull Servant name in the graveyard too, to make your King of Skull Servant even bigger than he already is. 3 copies of Wightlord. Wightlord is very cool. He's the latest bit of support that we've got for Skull Servants. If you have Skull Servant or King of Skull Servants in your graveyard, you can send this card from your hand or field to the graveyard, and then you're able to send cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard up to the number of Skull Servant or King of Skull Servants in your graveyard. That's a great way of just milling a bunch of cards into your deck, because you might get lucky and mill some of your other white monsters as well, as to make their effects pop off even more too. But not only that, if this card's in the graveyard, you can banish it from the graveyard and target 1 Skull Servant or King of Skull Servants in your graveyard, and you're able to special summon it, which is just absolutely crazy because it's a good way to get some revival that you're not always relying on Mezuki. So 3 copies of Wightlord I think is very essential. 3 copies of Wightprince, arguably the MVP of the deck. Wightprince is great because if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can send 1 Skull Servant and 1 Lady in White from your hand and or deck to the graveyard as well. That's why it's very important that you need to run 2 copies of the original Skull Servant as well in order for Wightprince to get his effects to pop off. Not only that, you can banish 2 Skull Servants and this card from your graveyard in order to special summon 1 King Skull Servant from your deck, which is a great way to just special summon the King of Skull Servant directly from deck. And if you're pairing this along with Burial from a Different Dimension, you're able to bring out a 3000 attack King of Skull Servant with no cost at all. So 3 copies of Wightprince essential. And pairing with it to the Lady in White. Honestly, we most just use her to fulfill the cost of Wightprince, but she also has a decent effect when she's face up on the field. Level 3 or lower zombie type monster you control cannot be destroyed by battle and are unaffected by the effects of spell and trap cards that your opponent uses. We also use Wightprincess. Wightprincess, when she's normal summoned, you're able to send Wightprince from deck to the graveyard, so it's a good way to get your combos going. But not only that, I find Wightprincess effect that you're able to send it from hand or field to the graveyard to make all monsters currently on the field lose attack and defense equal to their own level / rank times 300 until the end of this turn. This is just a great way of getting their name into the graveyard, but also making a bunch of other monsters on field very weak, that you're able to use your King of Skull Servant with a very high attack to just beat into some monsters for games. So Wightprincess I find to be very good to run at 1 copy. I like to run 1 copy of Wightmare. Honestly, Wightmare isn't the greatest white monster that we run in this deck. If you want to switch it out for one of the other ones, that's absolutely fine. But I still think it serves its purpose. It's just good at like extending names into the graveyard as well, which I really like. You can discard this card and activate one of the following effects with Wightmare, you can target one of your banished Skull Servant or Wightmares and return to the graveyard, or you can target one of your banished Lady in White or King of Skull Servants and special summon it. And considering that a lot of decks banish nowadays, I think that Wightmare being able to recycle banished material is just really good. So one copy I find to be very good. One copy of Mezuki. Mezuki's only here because he pretty much acts as a monster reborn. If he's in the graveyard, you can banish him in the graveyard, target one zombie monster in the graveyard and special summon the target. We have Wightlord to pretty much do that now for King of Skull Servants, but Mezuki is still pretty good. Going on to the Horus stuff now, 3 copies of Imsety. If you're not familiar with the Horus monsters, they're all level 8 monsters that are able to special summon themselves from the graveyard if you control King Sarcophagus. But honestly, their effects don't really matter too much except for Imsety's, because Imsety you're able to discard him and one other card in order to add one King's Sarcophagus from your deck to your graveyard, from your deck to your hand, and then you're able to draw one card additionally from that. So Imsety is really good at getting the combos going for the Horus monsters. And also, since all the Horus monsters are level 8, we're able to use them on field to go for some of our rank plays. So I definitely think it's really important you run 3 copies of Imsety. We also run 1 copy of Hapi and 1 copy of Blessing. Honestly, their effects don't matter too much. We mostly just use them as the rank 8 fodder. I also run 2 copies of King Sarcophagus. Honestly, I only think 2 copies is more than enough that you're going to be using. It's a continuous spell, so it always stays on the field. Has the effect that Horus monsters you control cannot be destroyed by card effects that do not target them. So it's a good bit of protection for your Horus monsters if you don't get to the point where you're able to just rank play using them. But not only that, King Sarcophagus is very good at filling up your graveyard with some Horus stuff and also getting some good discards in as well. Because with King Sarcophagus, you can activate the effect. You can send 1 card from your hand to the graveyard and then send 1 Horus monster from your deck to the graveyard. And you can activate this effect up to 4 times per turn, so it's a good way to completely fill your graveyard to get all of your Horus stuff out on the field. And if you're able to discard some good stuff like your Wightmare, like your Wight monsters, then your plays can pretty much kick off from there. So 2 copies of King Sarcophagus. I like to run 2 copies of Mass Change 2. This is pretty much just to go into Darklaw. I find this great because Darklaw can be quite a menace depending on what the matchup is. So I like having a very problematic monster you're able to easily go into, and most of our monsters are dark monsters anyways. But not only that, you need to discard a card in order to get Mass Change 2 to go off, and again, we want to fill up our graveyard as much as possible, so if we get some good discards, the synergy is very good with this too. 1 copy of Foolish Burial, pretty self-explanatory. It's a Skull Servant deck. Same with 1 for 1, it's a Skull Servant deck, so you want to be running this at 1 copy as well. I like to run 1 copy of Pot of Prosperity. Although the deck can be consistent enough, we still need a little bit more to get like the consistency up to just the next level. And I think Pot of Prosperity is the best way to go about doing that. Although it sucks that your opponent takes only half damage after this effect resolves, but what you can do is activate this after the battle phase if your opponent manages to survive that long in order to dig deeper into your deck for some better cards that you can go into your next turn. So 1 copy of Pot I find to be very good. 2 copies of Burial from a Different Dimension. We really don't want our stuff being banished. We want all of our monsters to be in the graveyard in order to pump up King of Skull Servant to as high of an attack we can. So having Burial from a Different Dimension I find to be very important for this. This card you're able to target up to 3 banished monsters and return to the graveyard. It's a great synergy, especially with your Wightprince, considering that Wightprince needs to banish itself and 2 other monsters in order to special summon King of Skull Servants. So what you're able to do, if all you have is Wightprince in the graveyard and you activate his effects, your King of Skull Servant you're going to bring out a 0 attack, but with Burial from a Different Dimension you're able to get those Skull Servants back into the graveyard to make your King of Skull Servant 3000 attack. Also like to run 1 Call by the Grave. Although this is a going second deck, we still don't want to be interrupted when we're comboing off, so Call by the Grave I find to be very important. Going into some board breakers now, 3 copies of Forbidden Droplet. Not only is it great for negating monster effects, we also get a bunch of discards off this as well, and also the monsters that we negate that your opponent controls, their attacks are cut in half as well. So this is just a really good way of making sure that your plays pop off, and it makes things a little bit easier when you're going for the OTK. Then finally, 3 copies of Super Poly. This is a going second build, so Super Poly can be an absolutely devastating card to use on your opponent considering that they can't respond to it. So I definitely recommend you guys run it at 3 copies in this deck. Going on to the extra deck now, we run 3 Super Poly targets. We run Mudragon of the Swamp, Garura, and Star Venom Fusion Dragon. These are all just Super Poly targets that can be very generic, so definitely recommend you run 1 copy of each. We run the 2 Darklaws just because we run the Mass Change 2, so Darklaw is pretty much the best dark mass hero that you're able to go into. Dark Law is a one-sided macro cosmos, but not only that, if your opponent adds a card from their deck to their hand while Dark Law is in the field, you're able to once per turn banish one random card from your opponent's hand. Going to the XZ's monsters now, we run one copy of the Zombie Vampire. Pretty much all the XZ's we run are rank 8s, and we pretty much only go into them using the Horus engine, but there are some very powerful cards to go with them, so the Zombie Vampire is no exception for this. Neither player can target the Zombie Vampire with effects of special summoned monsters, except for those that are special summoned from the graveyard. But not only that, you can detach one material from this card, and each player sends the top 4 cards from their deck to the graveyard. Then, if any monster was sent to the graveyard by this effect, you can special summon one of those monsters to your field, which is just absolutely great to get another body on the field and also fill up our own graveyard with a bunch of our Skull Servant monsters too. So I definitely recommend you run one copy of the Zombie Vampire. We like to run one copy of Garunix Eternity. You're able to pick this card up from the Fire King structure deck. The main reason we run this is because this is going second deck, and what Garunix Eternity does is that if this card is XZ summoned, you can destroy all other monsters on the field, which is just a great board wipe, so I definitely recommend you guys run it at 1. We also run number 90 Galaxy Eyes Photon Lord. Reason why I run this is because this deck doesn't set up a whole lot of negates, so we try to take as much as we can. The whole point of this deck is to basically OTK, but if we're not able to do that and we need to set up some negates going into the next turn, having a few of these cards can be very, very important. And number 90 Galaxy Eyes Photon Lord is a good monster negate, so I definitely recommend you guys run it at 1 copy in this deck. And I also recommend you run 1 copy of number 38 Hope Harbinger. Number 90 is a monster negate, and number 38 is a spell negate. So depending on what the matchup is, you can decide whichever one is better for that. So I definitely recommend running one of each of those monsters. Going into the links now, we run 1 copy of Relinquished Anima. Unfortunately, Link Repo is still banned, so we only have this as our generic Link 1 for a level 1 monster. Anima is still good though, but we mostly use this if we're kind of bricked first turn. We need a monster in the graveyard as soon as possible. Anima is a good way of getting monsters into the graveyard by normal summoning and then linking them off into this guy. But not only that, Anima also has the effect that you can target one face-up monster this card points to and equip that face-up monster to this card, and then this card gains attack equal to the equipped monster. So I definitely recommend you guys running him at 1 copy in the deck. Also run 1 copy of Pentastag. He's a generic Link 2, all you need is 2 effect monsters to go into him. He has 1 link arrow pointing down in our direction, and Pentastag has the effect that if your linked monster attacks a defense position monster, you're able to inflict piercing battle damage to your opponent, which is just really, really great because if your opponent is playing the defensive, it can be hard for us to OTK them. But using Pentastag's effect, if we're able to have this pointing at King of Skull Servant and we're able to use King Skull Servant to attack in, we can pretty much win the game from there. So 1 copy of Pentastag. I also like to run 1 copy of IP. This can be a bit of interruption if we're going the distance with this deck. IP can be a good way of kind of when you're going into turn 3 and you need to bait out your opponent's plays a little bit. IP is very good at disrupting them depending what link monsters you go into with her. The main one being, of course, SP Little Knight, who's pretty much a burden on modern day Yu-Gi-Oh right now. So SP Little Knight, when it is link summoned using a link monster, or any deck monster for that matter, but if you're using the link monster like IP to go into her, you're able to target 1 card on the field or in the graveyard and just banish it. But not only that, SP Little Knight is also very good and it's generic as well, that you can actually set up a little bit of a interruption as well, because SP Little Knight has the effect that when your opponent activates a card or effect, you can quick effect target 2 face-up monsters on the field, including a monster you control, and just banish both until the end phase, which is just another good bit of interruption. And rounding things off, 1 copy of Nightmare Phoenix and 1 copy of Nightmare Unicorn. Phoenix is good at just outing spells and traps, and Unicorn could just out pretty much anything. Not only are they good for outing stuff, but also you have to discard in order to get them to pop off, and if you're very lucky with what you're discarding, you can probably extend your placement there. So I definitely recommend running 1 of each of those guys to round off the extra deck. Going to the side deck now, I run 3 copies of Lava Golem. I always like to have some form of Kaiju in the side deck, no matter what the deck is, just because you never know what your opponent's playing. And Lava Golem's just great because it's able to out 2 monsters rather than 1. And considering it's only 3000 attack, you're able to easily out him with some of the monsters in this deck. And our King of Skull Servant's very, very easy to get beyond 3000 attack. So I definitely recommend you run Lava Golem in this build. I like to run 1 copy of Baldrake, 1 Magnamut, and 1 Druid Swarm. It's just nice having some Bestials. I know it's a bit of a fire format right now, but there still are a bunch of dark decks out there like Yubel. So these guys can be not only good interruptions, but also good way of getting bodies on the field. If we think that we're not going to be able to OTK our opponent, you're good to get bodies on the field that you're able to link away into your interruptions. So I definitely recommend running 1 copy each of these guys. 3 copies of Lancia. We don't want any of our stuff being banished, so Lancia is just a good way of kind of combating that. Especially because a bunch of decks just banish nowadays, and if we're going against the likes of Runic, it can be very, very problematic for us, so I definitely recommend running 3 copies of Lancia. 3 Cosmic Cyclone. These are just for the back row decks, some Stun and Runic as well. You want to be careful when you're putting Lancia with your Cosmic Cyclone depending on what you're siding in, because Cosmic Cyclone actually banishes a spell and trap for the cost of 1,000 life points. So definitely just be careful when you're siding in. And finally, rounding off the deck, we have 3 copies of Dimensional Barrier. We don't really solely rely on the one type of extra deck monster. Our main focus is just getting our King of Skull Servant up to as high an attack as we possibly can, and then going in from there. So if we're in a situation where we need to go first and we're siding this in, we're well able to stop our opponent from special summoning or activating the effects of monsters of a certain kind, i.e. Ritual, Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, or Pendulum. And honestly, I just think Dimensional Barrier is probably one of the best floodgates that can really just harm our opponent and not really affect us at all. So I definitely recommend you guys run it in the side deck at 3 copies. So that about does it for the build. Please let me know what you guys think. I'm really happy with the way this deck turned out. I know there's a lot of different ways you're able to play Skull Servant. This is just the one that I've been playing a lot lately, and I actually really enjoy it. Further down the line, we'll probably explore some other ways you can play it. I used to play Branded Skull Servant, but since Branded got hit, I kind of stepped away from that. But I still think it's a deck that we might try explore in the future. Also, Grass came to one recently, so that could be something else that we can explore too. But for the time being, this is the deck I'm playing with, and I'm having a lot of fun. I definitely recommend you guys try it as well. If you guys want to build this deck in real life, definitely check out the affiliate links in the description below. It directly supports the channel for us to make more content like this. Also, if you want to see videos like this early, be sure to consider becoming a member of the channel as well, because we really appreciate all the support from doing that, or even if you guys just like the video, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Anyway, it really helps us bring you guys all these videos. So thanks for watching, happy Halloween, and we'll see you next time.